This is my 2000 B5 S4 that I bought broken. Over the past few weeks, I've been restoring it and making it better, and today we're going to be transforming the way this car handles. We've already replaced quite a bit on this car to get it roadworthy, including wheels, tires, brakes, and a control arm. The next step before fun parts is to get all the wheels pointed the same direction. We are on the way to the S4. We've got a whole list of stuff to do today. First and foremost, we're getting it aligned. It's like a 15-minute drive on low-speed roads. I don't normally suggest driving your car if it's really out of alignment, but we didn't have to go too far. I literally can't believe it made it to Les Schwab, but I'm so stoked. Yes! The S4 is now professionally aligned, which is incredible. I am so excited to actually see how this car drives now that it doesn't have a ridiculous amount of toe. I'm gonna show you just how bad it actually was. So this is just a standard alignment. You can see the adjustment though. We're looking at -2 degrees of toe. Oh my God. The front tires were towed in and the rear tires were towed out, but to different degrees. The right was towed out roughly 3 degrees more than the other, which is notable. Generally, when a car has towed out rear and towed in front, it's gonna be really unstable when there's weight transfer at high speeds, which is why it was unstable at high speeds. So now we're gonna drive it home on these new alignments and it's going to be incredible. Now, I don't think people really appreciate how good an alignment is for your car unless they've driven one that's completely out of whack. Oh, I'm literally so stoked right now. It handles so much better. I am so excited. You guys have no idea how excited I am. This car works and it is so much fun. I was worried it was actually like broken, but dude, we're good. The steering wheel's straight, it corners way better than I thought it would, and I have a much better suspension on the way. So this car is just gonna be wild when I'm done with it. Oh, I'm just giddy. Oh my God. I'm trying to maintain some semblance of professionalism with this, but I'm genuinely just so excited that this car works and I'm actually driving it around. I'm at normal road speed and it doesn't feel like it's gonna dive into a corner. Every time I shift, it doesn't feel like a floating Jeep. It works. To say that a proper alignment made this car feel like a completely different vehicle would be a dramatic understatement. It felt like a real car and less like a project car, something I could actually drive around and not fear for my life with. Now that the alignment's out of the way, we're good to start on our first performance upgrade in the handling department. While this car handles great for a 22-year-old vehicle, there's quite a bit of body roll from both its age and its design as a platform. One of my favorite ways to help remedy this is to upgrade the rear sway bar. I picked up a stiff 034 Motorsports upgraded rear sway bar, and it is a dramatic upgrade over the stock one. One of the quirks of the B5 platform is that it has a pretty flimsy rear subframe. Consequently, I got some subframe reinforcement brackets to go with the new sway bar. That way, when I'm in a corner, I won't snap my subframe due to the extra stiffness. I also really want to compliment the build quality of these parts, and I highly suggest them. They're gorgeous. Generally speaking, replacing a rear sway bar is rather simple. They are commonly held on at both end links and at the subframe in 2 different brackets. After you jack up the car, you need to remove the bolts on the end links. Depending on how your car was treated and if it's rusty or not, these bolts will either be easy or the bane of your existence. I got really lucky with the TT because the bolts came right off. Sometimes you get lucky. This was not one of those cases. The bolts on the S4 end links were incredibly seized and required way more leverage than I thought I would initially need to get the bolts off. The driver's side ended up coming off without a hitch, and I was working with a friend at the time, so I let him take care of the other side. Things were looking good on his end, so I decided to move on to the brackets itself and get that prepped to remove. These ones weren't really seized on whatsoever and were much easier to remove. They're really easy to find because they're connected directly to the subframe and they look like 2 little metal U brackets. I feel like people get pretty scared of modifying their suspension because they think everything's going to explode on them when they remove one bolt, because it generally holds a bunch of pressure. If you're just jacking up the car, the rear sway bar by design won't be under any tension. Sometimes it may be tight in there, but not enough to actually spring out at you. I'll explain my understanding of this in more detail in a little bit. At this point in the install, everything was going swimmingly. We were on pace to finish rapidly, and things were looking up. But sometimes things don't go your way when you're working on a project car, and this happened to be one of those times. Did you snap it off? What are we gonna do?
Wait till your new part arrives.
God, no, no. Well, that is a setback. New nut hardware.
New nut hardware.
This is not supposed to come off with the bolt. The bolts on the ball joint of the sway bar end link were so corroded that when we tried to remove the passenger side, it snapped the bolt itself. This left me with the only option of ordering new end links since we didn't have enough room left on the bolt to mount the new hardware. It was really frustrating at the time, but at the end, I'm pretty glad I ended up having to do this. These new parts obviously weren't going to show up today, so I spent the rest of the day getting the car to the point where it could sit for a few days while I waited for the new part. We very loosely got the reinforcement bracket in place, and we also removed the rear sway bar. Setting it next to the upgraded sway bar makes you realize just how small the stock one is. You can think of a rear sway bar as a sort of spring, and when your car's in a corner, that body roll is going to hold tension in this member itself. The stiffer the sway bar, the more body roll it can actually handle before it starts representing itself in the car. When you're in a corner, your car generally wants to tip over. This is due to the center of gravity not being at the point of contact between the wheels and the pavement. The primary job of sway bars is to stop the car from, well, swaying. Another way to look at them is that they are basically a spring that holds the potential energy generated from turning your car, and the stiffer they are, the more energy they can hold before the symptoms of body roll show up in your handling dynamics. Now that's a gross oversimplification of the suspension components because there are other parts of the system that work with this and change the dynamics themselves. But at a very high level, that's a good example for how to understand what sway bars will actually do when you upgrade them. Since I had a lot of time to kill while waiting for the new part, I wanted to work on improving the car. The previous owner had used some sort of a plasti dip to cover the front grille and make everything black. Some people might like this look, but it's not really for me. I personally love the vintage S4 logo, and I think it's a sin to cover it up. And I think the execution of it being blacked out wasn't done too well overall. Thankfully, Plasti Dip is easy to peel off. I feel like just the simple blacked out grille delete is something that really elevated the look of this car. It still needs work, but I think this is a step in the right direction. The end link showed up about a week later, and that means we needed to remove the stock ones. This is pretty easily accomplished if you jack the car up and remove the rear wheels. The stock one is bolted into the upper knuckle, and it's really easy to remove with 2 wrenches. I didn't know this before trying to remove it, but it's actually made out of plastic. Maybe breaking one of the end links and ordering these metal ones was a blessing in disguise. But upgrading from a plastic sway bar end link to a metal sway bar end link should increase the rigidity along with the actual sway bar upgrade themselves. My stock ones were literally falling apart at the seams of the ball joint, so they were due for a replacement anyways. Replacing these is actually quite simple. You kind of just put the new ones where the old ones were and rebolt them in. This is the stock sway bar end link over on the passenger side, and it is the reason why we ordered the upgraded ones anyways, because we snapped the bolt at the end. Putting the broken end link next to the new one shows you just how much of the bolt came off when we tried to remove it. Once I got both of the end links situated, I decided to start learning about the subframe reinforcement brackets that I ordered. The B5 subframe isn't built for rigidity. Since the rear sway bar bolts directly into the rear subframe, when you increase the tension that sway bar needs to hold by increasing the sway bar itself, you're increasing the tension that goes directly into the subframe of the car. Since the subframe by its original design wasn't meant to hold this increased tension from the upgraded sway bar, it's very likely you're going to bend and crack your subframe, which is a much more involved thing to replace. The sway bar bolts directly onto the subframe, but in this case, the sway bar will now bolt through the subframe into this new aluminum reinforcement bracket. This dramatically spreads the pressure from the upgraded sway bar to more resilient parts of the subframe itself, reducing the likelihood that it's going to break. This is what an unsupported side looks like, and you can see just how flimsy it is by its stock design. That is a very thin piece of metal that's being asked to hold a lot of pressure, hence why we want to upgrade it. Now this brings me to the second most frustrating part of this entire install. The different lengths of these bolts matter. One is designed to be smaller because there is a very specific place it needs to go. We're going to set this one aside for later. For now, I'm just getting everything roughly in place and not bolting anything down tightly. This is the upgraded sway bar, and these are the brackets that we're going to need to loop onto the sway bar itself before we can actually attach it. Once the bushings are fitted and the brackets are loosely on, you can slide it over the exhaust and into roughly where it's going to hang when it's in the car. The sway bar is adjustable and it has two different modes that you can put it in for how tense you want it to actually be. I put it in the least tense of the two settings because it's already so much stiffer than stock that I'm going to notice a huge difference, and it's really easy to change in the future if I want it stiffer. Now, it's very important which order you put these bolts in, because one of these is horrendously difficult to get to. You're going to use that smaller bolt that I mentioned we set aside earlier to put the top bolt of the bracket in on the passenger side. As you can see from the video, there is hardly any room to get this bolt in, and getting it threaded is one of the most difficult things you'll have to do in this entire install. To get it threaded, I actually used my finger to hold the bolt still and twisted the bracket itself to get it started. The biggest problem in this, and what makes it so difficult, is that the fuel tank is so close there's hardly any room, and definitely not enough room to get a standard wrench back there. I ended up finding an assortment of wrenches to try, and after talking with my neighbor, I had a whole selection to go with to see if one of them would work. It ended up being the second one in this lineup. A combination of a very narrow wrench and an offsetted opening is critical for getting this bolt in place. Thankfully, when you have this one done, the rest is really smooth sailing. The next thing I did was continue to reassemble the rest of the reinforcement bracket itself, and I just want to give another huge shout out to 034 Motorsports for the incredible tolerance of these pieces. The rest of the installation actually did go really smoothly. I finished buttoning up the reinforcement brackets, and once this was done, I went through and retightened all of the bolts in the entire system. There are a lot of bolts that I touched, so I made sure to tighten all of them more than once just to make sure that everything was buttoned up properly. One key note if you're going to install something like this on your car is to install everything loosely first before you tighten things down, because they're designed to be adjusted to the way your car specifically sits. You want to make sure everything fits loosely flush with the subframe and there's not much gaps between the bolts. That way all the pressure is distributed evenly and everything is good to go. The last thing I went ahead and tightened was the bottom of the end links. This was a multi-day project, but most of that was just because I was waiting for shipping, and trying to find really unique wrenches to solve a very specific use case. Other than that, this install really wasn't all that difficult, and it was rather procedural. I'm personally of the vocation that sway bars are one of the most fun mods you can do to your car. It's a fantastic way to increase both the road feel that you get through the wheel, as well as reduce the body roll that plagues cars like this. Plus, these new parts look incredible on this suspension. All that was left was to button up the car and start her up and go for a test drive. I was getting more and more excited, but then I realized that since this install took so long due to the lack of parts, I probably was going to need to jump the car. I knew this car had a pretty bad battery that needed replacing going into this, so I was prepared for this, but the jumper pack didn't quite work as I was hoping. Well, that's kind of an anticlimactic end, but we got all the parts we were trying to get on. Now all we have to do is get a new battery and then we can test drive it. I managed to get the car jumped traditionally later that evening, but it was too dark to record. I took the car around the block, and even just low-speed corners were enough to show me that this made a tremendous difference. The body roll is almost non-existent. I'll go more into depth on this in the next video when I have a new battery sourced and ready to put in. From my initial impressions, this dramatically changed the way the weight transfer feels going into a corner. It feels like you could coerce the car into both oversteer and understeer depending on how you modulate the throttle and the braking. In other words, the car is far more neutral, and that was precisely my goal. Overall, I can't recommend a sway bar for your B5 S4 more. I think this is one of the best mods you can do to this car, and it will night and day make this car feel like something completely different. While this car doesn't handle as well as my TT225, I attribute most of that to the really heavy engine and the difference in wheelbase. The TT is by design good at really nimble and small technical corners. The S4 is an Autobahn special that can hold its own against most cars in any sort of a cornering situation, but has a tremendous emphasis on a really aggressive acceleration pattern. I have so many plans for this car, and I'm really excited to take you on this journey with me. In the next episode, I'll be putting a new battery in the car and getting it to the point where I can drive it around, and we'll take it on its first official fun drive. This car needs a lot of work from the paint perspective, and I'm going to try to restore it as a learning experience, and worst case scenario, we'll make a decision as to what we want the car to look like going forward. Be that a respray or wrapping or what our long-term goals are for the car. Either way, thank you so much for watching this video. I really appreciate it, and the feedback has been phenomenal. If you enjoyed the video or learned something, consider dropping a like and subscribing. It really helps my channel out. Once again, thank you so very much for watching. I hope you have a wonderful day.